4. Shun-tse, realist. The evil nature of man, the necessity of law. There were many weaknesses in Mencius's philosophy, and his contemporaries exposed them with a fierce delight. Was it true that men were by nature good, and were led to evil only by wicked institutions? Or was human nature itself responsible for the ills of society? Here was an early formulation of a conflict that has raged for some eons between reformers and conservatives. Does education diminish crime, increase virtue, and lead men into utopia? Are philosophers fit to govern states, or do their theories worse confound the confusion which they seek to cure? The ablest and most hard-headed of Mencius's critics was a public official who seems to have died at the age of 70, about the year 235 B.C. As Mencius had believed human nature to be good in all men, so Shun-tse believed it to be bad in all men. Even Shun and Yao were savages at birth. Shun, in the fragment that remains of him, writes like another Hobbes. The nature of man is evil. The good which it shows is factitious. There belongs to it even at his birth the love of gain. And as actions are in accordance with this, contentions and robberies grow up, and self-denial and yielding to others are not to be found by nature. There belong to it envy and dislike, and as actions are in accordance with these, violence and injuries spring up, and self-devotedness and faith are not to be found. There belong to it the desires of the ears and the eyes, leading to the love of sounds and beauty, and as the actions are in accordance with these, lewdness and disorder spring up, and righteousness and propriety, with their various orderly displays, are not to be found. It thus appears that to follow man's nature and yield obedience to its feelings will assuredly conduct to contentions and robberies, to the violation of the duties belonging to everyone's lot, and the confounding of all distinctions, till the issue will be a state of savagery, and that there must be the influence of teachers and laws, and the guidance of propriety and righteousness, from which will spring self-denial, yielding to others, and an observance of the well-ordered regulations of conduct, till the issue will be a state of good government. The sage kings of antiquity, understanding that the nature of man was thus evil, set up the principles of righteousness and propriety, and framed laws and regulations to straighten and ornament the feelings of that nature and correct them, so that they might all go forth in the way of moral government and in agreement with reason. Shun-tse concluded, like Turgenev, that nature is not a temple but a workshop. She provides the raw material, but intelligence must do the rest. By proper training, he thought, these naturally evil men might be transformed even into saints, if that should be desirable. Being also a poet, he put Francis Bacon into doggerel. You glorify nature and meditate on her. Why not domesticate her and regulate her? You obey nature and sing her praise. Why not control her course and use it? You look upon the seasons with reverence and await them. Why not respond to them by seasonly activities? You depend on things and marvel at them. Why not unfold your own ability and transform them? 5. Zhuang-tse, idealist. The return to nature, governmentless society, the way of nature, the limits of the intellect, the evolution of man, the button molder, the influence of Chinese philosophy in Europe. The return to nature, however, could not be so readily discouraged. It found voice in this age as in every other, and by what might be called a natural accident, its exponent was the most eloquent writer of his time. Zhuang-tse, loving nature as the only mistress who always welcomed him, whatever his infidelities or his age, poured into his philosophy the poetic sensitivity of a Rousseau, and yet sharpened it with the satiric wit of a Voltaire. Who could imagine Mencius so far forgetting himself as to describe a man as having a large goiter like an earthenware jar? Zhuang belongs to literature as well as to philosophy. He was born in the province of Sung and held minor office for a time in the city of Qiyuan. He visited the same courts as Mencius, but neither in his extant writings mentions the other's name. Perhaps they loved each other like contemporaries. Story has it that he refused high office twice. When the Duke of Wei offered him the prime ministry, he dismissed the royal messengers with a curtness indicative of a writer's dreams. Go away quickly, and do not soil me with your presence. I had rather amuse and enjoy myself in a filthy ditch than be subject to the rules and restrictions in the court of a sovereign. While he was fishing, 2 great officers brought him a message from the king of Ku. I wish to trouble you with the charge of all my territories. Zhuang tells us, answered without turning away from his fishing. I have heard that in Ku there is a spirit like tortoiseshell, the wearer of which died 3,000 years ago, and which the king keeps in his ancestral temple in a hamper covered with a cloth. Was it better for the tortoise to die and leave its shell to be thus honored? Or would it have been better for it to live and keep on dragging its tail after it over the mud? The two officers said it would have been better for it to live and draw its tail after it over the mud. "Go your ways," said Zhuang. "I will keep on dragging my tail after me through the mud." His respect for governments equaled that of his spiritual ancestor, Lao Tse. He took delight in pointing out how many qualities kings and governors shared with thieves. If by some negligence on his part a true philosopher should find himself in charge of a state, his proper course would be to do nothing, and allow men in freedom to build their own organs of self-government. I have heard of letting the world be, and exercising forbearance. I have not heard of governing the world. The Golden Age, which preceded the earliest kings, had no government, and Yao and Shun, instead of being so honored by China and Confucius, should be charged with having destroyed the primitive happiness of mankind by introducing government. In the age of perfect virtue, men lived in common with birds and beasts, and were on terms of equality with all creatures as forming one family. How could they know among themselves the distinctions of superior men and small men? The wise man, thinks Chuan, will take to his heels at the first sign of government, and will live as far as possible from both philosophers and kings. He will court the peace and silence of the woods. Here was a theme that 1,000 Chinese painters would seek to illustrate. And let his whole being, without any impediment of artifice or thought, follow the divine Tao, the law and flow of nature's inexplicable life. He would be sparing of words, for words mislead as often as they guide, and the Tao, the way and the essence of nature, can never be phrased in words or formed in thought. It can only be felt by the blood. He would reject the aid of machinery, preferring the older, more burdensome ways of simpler men. For machinery makes complexity, turbulence, and inequality, and no man can live among machines and achieve peace. He would avoid the ownership of property, and would find no use in his life for gold. Like Timon, he would let the gold lie hidden in the hills, and the pearls remain unsought in the deep. His distinction is in understanding that all things belong to the one treasury, and that death and life should be viewed in the same way, as harmonious measures in the rhythm of nature, waves of one sea. The center of Zhuang's thought, as of the thought of that half-legendary Lao Tse who seemed to him so much profounder than Confucius, was a mystic vision of an impersonal unity, so strangely akin to the doctrines of Buddha and the Upanishads that one is tempted to believe that Indian metaphysics had found its way into China long before the recorded coming of Buddhism 400 years later. It is true that Zhuang is an agnostic, a fatalist, a determinist, and a pessimist, but this does not prevent him from being a kind of skeptical saint, a Tao-intoxicated man. He expresses his skepticism characteristically in a story. The penumbra said to the umbra, "At one moment you move, at another you are at rest. At one moment you sit down, at another you get up. Why this instability of purpose?" "I depend," replied the umbra, "upon something which causes me to do as I do, and that something depends upon something else which causes it to do as it does. How can I tell you why I do one thing or do not do another? When the body is decomposed, the mind will be decomposed along with it. Must not the case be pronounced very deplorable? The change, the rise and dissolution of all things continually goes on, but we do not know who it is that maintains and continues the process. How do we know when any one begins? How do we know when he will end? We have simply to wait for it, and nothing more." In an eclipse, the penumbra is the partly illuminated space between the umbra, the complete shadow, and the light. Perhaps in Zhuang's allegory, the complete shadow is the body, interrogated by the partly illuminated mind. These problems, Zhuang suspects, are due less to the nature of things than to the limits of our thought. It is not to be wondered at that the effort of our imprisoned brains to understand the cosmos of which they are such minute particles should end in contradictions, antinomies, and befuddlement. This attempt to explain the whole in terms of the part has been a gigantic immodesty, forgivable only on the ground of the amusement which it has caused. For humor, like philosophy, is a view of the part in terms of the whole, and neither is possible without the other. The intellect, says Zhuangzi, can never avail to understand ultimate things or any profound thing, such as the growth of a child. Disputation is a proof of not seeing clearly, and in order to understand the Tao, one must sternly suppress one's knowledge. We have to forget our theories and feel the fact. Education is of no help towards such understanding. Submersion in the flow of nature is all important. What is the Tao that the rare and favored mystic sees? It is inexpressible in words. Weakly and with contradictions we describe it as the unity of all things, their quiet flow from origin to fulfillment, and the law that governs that flow. Before there were heaven and earth, from of old it was, securely existing. In that cosmic unity all contradictions are resolved, all distinctions fade, all opposites meet. Within it and from its standpoint there is no good or bad, no white or black, no beautiful or ugly, no great or small. If one only knows that the universe is but as small as a tare seed, and the tip of a hair is as large as a mountain, then one may be said to have seen the relativity of things. In that vague entirety no form is permanent, and none so unique that it cannot pass into another in the leisurely cycle of evolution. The seeds of things are multitudinous and minute. On the surface of the water they form a membranous texture. When they reach to where the land and water join, they become the lichens that form the clothes of frogs and oysters. Coming to life on mounds and heights, they become the plantain, and receiving manure appear as crow's feet. The roots of the crow's foot become grubs, and its leaves butterflies. This butterfly is changed into an insect and comes to life under a furnace. Then it has the form of a moth. The mother after 1,000 days becomes a bird. The yin-shi united with the bamboo produces the king-ning. This the panther the horse, and the horse the man. Man then enters into the great machinery of evolution, from which all things come forth, and which they enter at death. It is not as clear as Darwin, but it will serve. In this endless cycle man himself may pass into other forms. His present shape is transient, and from the viewpoint of eternity may be only superficially real, part of Maya's deceptive veil of indifference. Once upon a time I, Zhuangzi, dreamt I was a butterfly, fluttering hither and thither, to all intents and purposes a butterfly. I was conscious only of following my fancies as a butterfly, and was unconscious of my individuality as a man. Suddenly I awoke, and there I lay myself again. Now I do not know whether I was then a man dreaming that I was a butterfly, or whether I am now a butterfly dreaming that I am a man. Death is therefore only a change of form, possibly for the better. It is, as Ibsen was to say, the great button molder who fuses us again in the furnace of change. Zhe Lai fell ill and lay gasping at the point of death, while his wife and children stood around him weeping. Li went to ask for him and said to them, "Hush, get out of the way. Do not disturb him in his process of transformation." Then, leaning against the door, he spoke to the dying man. Zhe Lai said, "A man's relations with the yin and the yang is more than that to his parents. If they are hastening my death, and I do not obey, I shall be considered unruly. There is the great mass of nature that makes me carry this body, labor with this life, relax in old age and rest in death. Therefore that which has taken care of my birth is that which will take care of my death. Here is a great founder casting his metal. If the metal dancing up and down should say, 'I must be made into a moye,' a famous old sword, the great founder would surely consider this metal an evil one. So, if merely because one has once assumed the human form, one insists on being a man and a man only, the author of transformation will be sure to consider this one an evil being. Let us now regard heaven and earth as a great melting pot, and the author of transformation as a great founder, and wherever we go shall we not be at home? Quiet is our sleep, and calm is our awakening." When Chuang himself was about to die, his disciples prepared for him a ceremonious funeral, but he bade them desist. "With heaven and earth for my coffin and shell, with the sun, moon, and stars as my burial regalia, and with all creation to escort me to the grave, are not my funeral paraphernalia ready to hand?" The disciples protested that unburied he would be eaten by the carrion birds of the air, to which Chuang answered with the smiling irony of all his words, "Above ground I shall be food for kites, below I shall be food for mole crickets and ants. Why rob one to feed the other?" If we have spoken at such length of the ancient philosophers of China, it is partly because the insoluble problems of human life and destiny irresistibly attract the inquisitive mind, and partly because the lore of her philosophers is the most precious portion of China's gift to the world. Long ago, in 1697, the cosmic-minded Leibniz, after studying Chinese philosophy, appealed for the mingling and cross-fertilization of East and West. "The condition of affairs among ourselves," he wrote, in terms which have been useful to every generation, is such that in view of the inordinate lengths to which the corruption of morals has advanced, I think it almost necessary that Chinese missionaries should be sent to us to teach us the aim and practice of national theology. For I believe that if a wise man were to be appointed judge of the goodness of peoples, he would award the golden apple to the Chinese. He begged Peter the Great to build a land route to China, and he promoted the foundation of societies in Moscow and Berlin for the opening up of China and the interchange of civilizations between China and Europe. In 1721, Christian Wolff made an attempt in this direction by lecturing at Halle on the practical philosophy of the Chinese. He was accused of atheism and dismissed, but when Frederick mounted the throne he called him to Prussia and restored him to honor. The Enlightenment took up Chinese philosophy at the same time that it carved out Chinese gardens and adorned its homes with chinoiserie. The physiocrats seem to have been influenced by Lao Tse and Chuang Tse in their doctrine of laissez-faire, and Rousseau at times talked so like the old master that we at once correlate him with Lao Tse and Chuang, as we should correlate Voltaire with Confucius and Mencius, if these had been blessed with wit. "I have read the books of Confucius with attention," said Voltaire. "I have made extracts from them. I have found in them nothing but the purest morality, without the slightest tinge of charlatanism." Goethe, in 1770, recorded his resolution to read the philosophical classics of China, and when the guns of half the world resounded at Leipzig 43 years later, the old sage paid no attention to them, being absorbed in Chinese literature. May this brief and superficial introduction lead the reader on to study the Chinese philosophers themselves, as Goethe studied them, and Voltaire and Tolstoy.